So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Ondřej Ditrych, and I have the pleasure to welcome you all to our first Patočka Debate this year that the Institute of International Relations has the privilege of co-organizing with IVM in Vienna. And we meet here at a very important point in time. The results of the European Parliament election were announced a short time ago, and I have a great opportunity to hear almost immediate reflection of those results by two public intellectuals, the first of whom is Ivan Krastev. Ivan is chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, permanent fellow at IWM, and author of a number of publications, including some articles on European Parliament election, sort of, like I would say, foreseeing some of the trends, dynamics that we then actually saw developing. The second is Michael Žantovský. Michael Žantovský is now director of Václav Havel Library. But before that, he was a politician, he was a diplomat, he was advisor to the late President Václav Havel, as well as publicist, psychologist too. So let me now, without any further ado, give the floor to Ivan to deliver his opening remarks, if you may. Then we may hear some of the immediate response by Michael, and then open the conversation further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. First, thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming. I'm not sure if Patočka was alive that this was going to be the discussion he's going to choose today. And if he's going to come, this is going to be only because of Michael. But what I'm trying to do is the following. You know the results. And the interesting story is, in order for the elections to have a strong impact, not on politics, but on the imagination of people, the results should be unexpected. This is why Brexit has such an effect. This is why the elections of President Trump has an effect. From this point of view, many of the things that happened on Sunday were not so much unexpected. I'm going to give you 5 things that I was taking because I was part of a big survey that European Council on Foreign Relations was doing. So very briefly, in 7 or 8 minutes, so in order to start the conversation. So before the elections, we decided to try to see. We have been surveying in 15 of the biggest EU member states, including Czech Republic. And the first thing that came to us when we went through the data was that normally people try to imagine European politics similar to the political kind of a space that you follow most closely. And these days, this is the United States and the United Kingdom. Because outside of your country, if you look better, every one of you knows something about the US and the UK, and probably you don't know much about Bulgaria, which I know something. The interesting story is that in both countries, you have a highly polarized political space, which means that basically you have almost tribal identities. Being Republican or Democrat in the United States, you know that the number of the Democrats who said that they're not going to agree for their daughter or son to marry a Republican is higher than there was between the Catholics and Protestants at the end of the 19th century, and the other way around. I mean, this is symmetrical. So this is very tribal. The same about Remainer and Brexiteers in the UK. What we found in Europe is that, with the exception of Poland, where the situation very much resembles what we're talking about US and UK, it's a highly, highly polarized society. In most of the European countries, basically, it's not that voters cannot change their mind. The problem is that the voters cannot make their mind. People want change, but they are ready to go in a totally different directions. And I remember the very nice children's book in which there was somebody called Ronald. So there was a sentence in the book about Ronald who get out of the room, jump on the horse, and madly rode off in all directions. So basically, this is what you have. Of these 50% that declared that they are ready to vote on the European elections before the elections, 35 said that they have a preference, and 70% of these 35, they said that they are ready to change their preferences going in one way or the other. It's a very high volatility. And this was the first thing that we see. And this is not simply moving people from the mainstream parties to basically far left or far right. It's also people who on the last elections voted, for example, for AfD, who said we're going to go back to the CDU, or people who voted this way. So people are really moving in all directions. This is like a kind of a square in which the traffic lights were switched off. The second thing which was quite important was that there were two major narratives that you have about European elections before the elections. The first came from Mr. Salvini, Mr. Orban, and their major story was the elections is going to be a referendum on migration. And we went through the data, and migration is a major issue in every country, but only in Hungary, this is the most important issue. The reasons are very simple. The number of the people that came to Europe for the last year is much, much smaller than the number that came in 2015, 2016. So as a result of it, you're not going to see on the television the pictures of people crossing borders and so on. Just to give you the figure, the number of the people who illegally came to Europe in 2018 is equal to the number of tourists who are going to land on the Athens airport in a single day in August, around 120,000 people. So as a result of it, the pressure of the issue is totally uncompared with 2015, 2016. But what is even much more important, at the moment, there is not a major political party in Europe which is advocating open borders. When it comes to basically the external borders of the European Union, in a certain way, there was a certain type of consensus. They're totally different how people imagine this, they're totally different how they're going to argue it, but you don't have this debate. And thirdly, which is going to be more interesting for you, nevertheless, that the Czech Republic is an outlier on this. Personally, I had one hypothesis which was proved, but it was proved in such a radical way that I was destabilized. And I always believed, on the basis of my Bulgarian experience, that there are societies in which emigration is a much more important factor than migration, which means that people are much more worried of their own living than of foreigners coming. And I'm saying this because Czech Republic was not like this. Here, migration was more important than emigration. But one of the reasons is that the Czech Republic is a place of Central and Eastern Europe where relatively small amount of people has left. According to the data that they have, around 4%. Just give you other countries. Basically, 1/3 of the population of the Baltic republics is not there anymore. 3.4 million Romanians has left Romania in the last 10 years. We are talking a society of around 20 million. Around 70% of them are younger than 40. In the last 3 years, 10,000 doctors has left Romania. So for these societies, it became a major issue, and the fear of depopulation and basically emigration became so important that, according to the survey, the majority of Hungarians, Romanians, and Poles said that they would be ready even to support certain government policies which are going to restrict the opportunity for their own nationals to work abroad for a longer period of time. I'm saying this because one of the paradoxes of this type of migration issue is that the best and the worst for many of these countries is the same. The open borders within Europe. Now we are even not talking about anything which is connected outside of Europe. The second narrative came from President Macron, and it said these elections are going to be referendum for or against the European Union. The data didn't support this too, for a very simple reason. Now in Europe, in the way there is no major party that is advocating open borders, none of the Eurosceptic parties in Europe today is openly advocating exiting the European Union or exiting the euro. 2 years ago, Marine Le Pen was going to push for exiting the euro and asking for the referendum on the EU. Today, nobody wants to leave the European Union, everybody wants to govern the European Union. But also what was important is that unlike this clear divide between pro-Europeans and people who believe in the nation-state nationalists, we found 4 very different groups. 38% of Europeans don't believe that European Union works, but they also don't believe that nation-state works. And 65% of French and 67% of the Italians share these views. You have also a group of people who believe that European Union works and the nation state does not work, and many of these people are in Central and Eastern Europe. So from this point of view, support for the EU comes not so much that you so much like what you see in Brussels, but you don't want to be left in the same room with your government alone. So basically, Brussels comes as a kind of a counter power. And of course, there are people who believe that the nation state works and it does not work, but most of these people either in the Scandinavian countries or, for example, Austria had high results on this. The last on these things that I was trying to give you as a result was, as a result of it, we also expected that the turnout is going to be higher than it was before, because for the first time, basically, Europe became an issue. People had the feeling that what is happening in Europe matters to them. So now when we see the elections results, I do believe that some of these trends basically were there. I'm just going to make my 3 last points of post-elections kind of figure out. One, the expectations that the national populist parties are going to basically sweep European elections, and there's going to be a political earthquake in the words of Stephen Bannon and others, did not happen. Basically, the center did hold, nevertheless, that we don't know for how long. At the same time, the people who are disregarding the performance of Salvini and other political leaders like this are also wrong. Because if before some of these parties were much more perceived as a classical protest vote parties, these are political parties that are going to stay and they're going to have a structural importance for the European public space. Out of the 5 biggest individual party representation in the European Parliament, 4 are coming from these groups. So you have Marine Le Pen, you have Salvini, you have Brexit Party. From this point of view, this is quite important to understand that nevertheless that the numbers are not so big. For the first time, this type of a right is going to be a pan-European phenomenon, not simply a kind of a national footnote. And certainly this was the Greens and the Liberals who ended up to be one of the most important victors in this. But here the story is that the Green wave being very important and very strong generation vote, particularly your generation in the West, very much voted this way, but it didn't cross the East-West divide. There was a Green wave, but the Green wave was in Western Europe. What you see in Eastern Europe, and Slovakia and Romania was the strongest example of this, is that it was not so much the climate change, but the anti-corruption managed to mobilize and became the kind of a political identity of these new parties that had been created and that did very well on the elections. I'm going to end up with what we can expect from this European Parliament as a result of it. I do believe it's going to be very fragmented, but not simply very fragmented in the way most people are talking about this. They're going to say, oh, it's going to be fragmented because the conservatives and the socialist groups are losing their majority. It's going to be a much more complex coalition. You're going to have 4 political groups basically keeping the majority. I do believe it's going to be very fragmented because of 2 other reasons. First, the political families themselves are going to be much more fragmented. Normally, the Conservatives has a 92%, the EPP, 92% of cohesion, which means that in 92% of the cases, they vote the same way, different parties. I believe that this is not going to be the case. And the same goes for the Socialists and for the Liberals. For Greens, it's going to be probably easier, because it's also a small group. And the second reason why it's going to be much more fragmented is that for the first time, anything that politicians are going to do in the European Parliament, they'll know that can resonate much more in the domestic politics. Before, the party leaders, particularly the small parties, they even didn't know how their members of European Parliament voted on half of the issues because they go with how the group goes. Now, on certain issues that can have repercussions in the domestic politics, you're going to see much more domestic political considerations. So, from this point of view, it's going to be much more interesting. Is it going to be better? It's going to be Michael to tell you.
All right. There is a line that many journalists and politicians use after every unsuccessful election, and this is it was not as bad as could be expected. And I hate that line because it makes people close their eyes before long time trends. But in this particular instance, I think they may be partly right. And I will try to explain both sides of that perspective. And I largely will agree with Ivan and maybe elaborate on or slightly differ in some respects. But first of all, let me address the Czech mystery that he briefly mentioned. And actually, I read your research on the ECFR, and I was very impressed. Congratulations on that. And it is true that out of practically all the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the Czechs don't migrate. And I think it's not only true in recent perspective, but it's true historically. Czechs do not migrate. Why is that is a very interesting question. But for example, in the United Kingdom, one of the target countries, you have twice as many Slovak nationals as you have Czech nationals for a country half our size. So it's a factor of 4. And with countries like Lithuania, it's even higher. My suspicion is that either we are lazy, or we think of our country as so perfect that we see no reason to go elsewhere. You choose. The other thing that is evident from the research is that we are more concerned about the incoming migration and than many other countries. And again, it's slightly counterfactual. The number of foreign nationals in this country is around 500,000, which is 5% of the population, which happens to be almost exactly the EU average. Not more, nor less. So it's not that we won't have foreigners, we will, and you see some of them, many of them around. So it's not that we don't want foreigners, but the dirty word is Muslims. It's the xenophobia is in fact Islamophobia, and it may have to do with little or no experience this nation has ever had with Muslims, because unlike some of our Western neighbors, we had no ports, no colonies, no experience with that kind of migration, and unlike our southern neighbors like Bulgarians and Romanians and the Hungarians even, we had no experience with the Ottoman Empire, because some of our ancestors stopped the Ottomans at the gates of Vienna and at the banks of the Danube. So we are ignorant about Muslims, which is something that we should keep in mind when trying to explain why this prejudice, and prejudice it is because it stems out of ignorance, not out of experience, not out of knowledge. So when we try to analyze it and overcome it. Now, this was a detour. Now back to the last weekend's EU Parliament elections. Well, obviously the good news is the turnout. The 2014 EU Parliament elections showed the lowest turnout of voters across EU in 25 years. And this is a quite significant reversal of the trend at almost around 50%, which is a good number And even this country, which came second from in the last elections, have now progressed to third from the end. Well, not much of a success, but okay, something is better than nothing. But and I also agree with Ivan about the explanation for that. For the first time in a long time, the voters felt that Europe mattered. There was, and you wrote or said it elsewhere, there was drama connected to the elections, and in democracy, I agree 100%, you need drama. And otherwise, the voters will stay indifferent. Now, that I'm afraid is the end of the good news. The bad news is that the establishment, especially the two main parties of the establishment, the EPP and the Socialists and Democrats, suffered. And it was not the first time they suffered. They suffered for the second or third time in a row. And between 2009 and 2019, both EPP and Socialists and Democrats lost 40% of their seats in the European Parliament. 40%, that's huge. But it's not as bad as the numbers would suggest, because a close analysis shows that the seats did not go over to the other side, to the nationalists or the anti-Eurosceptics and whatnot. They went to the Liberals and the Greens. Actually, if you sum up the seats for EPP, SD, Greens, and Liberals in the 2014 and in the 2019 elections, the difference is 6 seats. No, that's not a major difference. That is tolerant. What should we make of the emergence or comeback of the Greens? Because it's a big difference against 2014, but it's a slight improvement on 2009. Could be a trend. Could also be an idiosyncrasy caused by some well-publicized events and public demonstrations over the last few months, and I'm not going into the detail of it because it would lead us elsewhere. But the total outcome of that, of course, as Ivan has already said, is that the parliament will be more fractured, it will be greener, it will likely be or want to be more federalist, because the Liberals out there and the Greens are among the most pro-federalist factions in Europe. For the same reason, it may lead to a less secure Europe, for all the talk about developing a joint security and defense arm of the European Union. Neither the Liberals nor the Greens are very enthusiastic about defense and security, so we can't expect much more of that. And the overall shift may be slightly left of the center, in spite of the fact that the EPP is still the strongest faction in the European Parliament. What we have criticized, many of us, over the last few years is the lack of vision for Europe, the lack of ethos for Europe. And I have to admit it's hard to see it, but it's only 48 hours after the last polls have closed. I don't quite see an emergence of a coherent vision for Europe with the European Parliament that emerged from the elections. There is still one unknown, and we have to factor that in, and that's Brexit. It's not a done deal. There are people, some of them attended the conference earlier today, who believe it can still be reversed. I don't, for one, and I even fear that it might lead to more rather than fewer complications if it happened. As a former psychologist, I always revert to the metaphor of a divorce, and as every psychologist knows, when the relationship is damaged to the degree that it is today damaged between Britain and the EU, it's better if the two parties go their own separate ways, and maybe 10 years later come back and reconsider the wisdom of the split. But it's so hard to patch up a broken relationship. And if we try to do that, I'm afraid that both EU and Britain would lose enormous amount of energy trying to do it without any guarantee of success. So I will stop here, and we can go back and forth.
Well, thank you for the opening words. I will have two straightforward questions, if I may, and then also be made by the audience to weigh in. Let me first make a very short proposition on the Islamophobia, and I just put forward it as a proposition because I don't actually know. But it seems to me, you talk about Islam and how that's really important, and I think it may be because somehow we appropriated this discourse of code of values, and the xenophobic part of the actual xenophobic part of the population sort of see themselves as protectors of these cultural values that they somehow appropriate, and they other Islam into into a different set of values which are radically contrary to that, and there may be a deep stratum of race underneath all that. But as I say, I'm not really sure about that myself. Let me go to the questions. Two straightforward questions. One goes back to sort of past, is reflective. One is oriented toward the future. You wrote some time ago that this European election might well be a referendum not on the EU, but rather on national governments. When we look at the historical turnout in the European election, doesn't that mean that perhaps we are too optimistic to say that the future of Europe became of concern to European populace or not? And the second question relates to the fragmentation that both of you mentioned. Is it, in your view, going to result in, say, more inclusiveness, breaking the wheel, breaking the sort of oligopoly of the two major party groups in the parliament? Or might it not also lead to an institutional paralysis? Now, especially, there is an informal council taking place today. It's very clear that the European Council will want to propose the next president of the European Commission. Of course, he will be subject to approval by the Parliament. So could it not also lead to kind of some paralysis that might be damaging? And it would kind of have more negative repercussions.
Thank you very much. Let's start with, first let's give you some data on this Islamic story, which is of course much more interesting from country to country, but one of the questions that we asked in these 15 countries was, what is the biggest security threat that Europe is facing? And here is the result that is going to strike you. In all 15 countries, radical Islam came as the biggest threat. In Poland, radical Islam came as the biggest threat than Russia, which I do believe was surprising even for the Poles. Why I'm saying this? Because in a certain way, and then you have, of course, in different countries, you have different perceptions. There are countries like Germany and Austria where the United States came as a much higher security threat than, for example, China or Russia. China was not to be seen in most of these. Turkey was not very high. But what we discovered is that there was a major difference between people who claim that migration is a major threat and people who claim that radical Islam is a major threat. And this is particularly clear in Germany and Austria. Many of the people who define Islam as a radical, is a major threat, are practicing Catholics and others who are quite open to migration. By the way, some of these people have been supporting people when they're coming and so on. They come from a very kind of a culture of universal solidarity. But for them, the biggest problem is not should we open our societies, but do we have the right to decide whom we are going to welcome? This is about basically the cultural cohesion. And there are people, basically, who said it's nevertheless who is coming, nobody should come. It's a much more ethnic, homogeneity group. And these two groups voted for very different parties. In the case of Austria, those who are against migration basically vote for the Freedom Party. Those who declared the radical Islam as a problem, they vote for the center-right, for Sebastian Kurz. So from this point of view, it's not simply different views, but these different views has a totally different kind of constituencies. And then when you go to your story about fragmentation and how it can work. Listen, it's going to work very, very more complex than people expect, at least for three reasons. We talk about who is winning, who is losing on the level of political families, political orientations. And also keep in mind that there is certain similarity between the Greens and the National Populists. This is the only two movements in Europe, not just political parties. But once the Greens, they want to save life. The others want to save their way of life. Once the people like Salvini, they're all the time attacking European Union for what European Union is doing. Greens attack the European Union for what they are not doing. But if you see on the level of energy, there are similarities because most of them have kind of a movement structure. They can get with people on the street. They can mobilize support, which is not just voting support. And from this point of view, this is quite important because one other study, which we didn't do, it was done by Bertelsmann a year ago, for me is extremely important to make my point on Europe. 67% of Europeans in all member states declare that the life was better before. Don't ask me when before. For different people, it's a different time. But even people who are in their 20s, basically your age, majority said that the life was better before, and in countries like Italy, 77% said the life is better before. I'm saying this because you have a very strong nostalgic mood all over Europe. And this is, I find, particularly challenging because European projects started with society that fear the past. They fear the past and they see all the problem solving in the future. So they go from a society destroyed by war, political radicalism at home and so on, and the future, everybody wanted to live in the future. And now you have a society that fears the future and everybody wants to go to the past. And I find this quite important because this time dimension in democracy, what really basically is very critically important. And then goes who is losing, who is winning on the level of countries and not on the level of parties. And here's the paradox. Macron symbolically lost with less than 1%, but he lost because he made himself to be a kind of a visionary leader of Europe, and he lost by an openly anti-European political party, and also lost by somebody whom he has defeated before. This is the worst loss. Like being defeated by somebody that you have won before. But In terms of real power, he got a lot because he's the biggest group in ALDE, I mean party group, and believe me, tonight he's going to push a lot of positions, who's going to get what, how it's going to be done. Germany didn't lose so much symbolically. CDU-CSU was the first party, but Germany lost a lot of influence in the European Parliament because before the strength of German position was not simply coming from its economy and the fact that it's the bigger country, but Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats usually were the two biggest groups in the conservative and socialist side. So the moment they can make a deal, everybody's making a deal. And then German Social Democrats are not going to dominate the socialist group at all in the way they have been doing before. And the German Christian Democrats are also not as strong as they were. So from this point of view, this is going to be a very different kind of a rebalancing of political power, not of kind of the real power, which is going, in my view, also to affect very much your fear of paralysis. Paralysis can easily come. I'm never being accused of being over-optimistic. This, of course, saves you big disappointments. This also probably does not allow you to capture certain opportunities. But one of my fear is that in the bad case scenario, European Parliament is going to look like the British Parliament, which means that you can have a negative majority for every issue, but it's going to have a very difficult to have a positive majorities. And from this point of view, don't look simply who is in which parliamentary group there. Because as I told you, the political families are not what they used to be. Bulgarian Socialist Party, on many issues, for example, concerning sexual minorities and others, are on the right of the center-right governing party. The same for the Romanian Social Democrats, who also not very... So from this point of view, when it comes to the actual vote, and exactly because some of these topics are becoming critically important in domestic politics, you don't expect them to vote in the way, for example, the majority of the socialist group are going to vote. And on many other issues, the same is going to be the problem with the conservatives. So how to break the idea of this kind of a negative majority is going to be critically important. And I want to end up that on the positive note. But there is one positive note. Nothing unifies like strong political competitors sitting next to you. The fact that they're going to be a big group around Mr. Salvini is going to have a disciplining effect. Because basically, when you see that your power is challenged, you should try to show unity, you should try to show that you can solve problems. So there is a risk. But if this risk is going to be realized, it's going to show that the process of kind of internal loss of cohesion has progressed more than these elections has shown. And just to give one great quote, when Michael started and saying that it is worse when all these politicians saying that it's in fact not as bad as we imagined. If you remember, King Lear has this famous line. He said, "There is no longer worst if we can say there is the worst." So from this point of view, this is true.
All right. Well, again, we have one general idea on which we will agree, and you just cited a specific instance of that. I mean, future is not what it used to be.
Yeah.
And for all that's worse. On the 2 points, you know, I have not a different perspective from Ivan, but maybe a complementary perspective, and I apologize for another bit of analysis. It strikes me as extraordinarily interesting that you have that amount of fear of the Islamic extremism in countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, which never experienced a single instance of Islamic extremism.
Just one footnote which is interesting for you. Of course, I was interested. For Czech Republic, probably it's not true, but let's give you something for Poland. People said Poland does not have experience with Islam. They have.
Oh, yes.
in London at the moment, because many of the Polish migrants to London are living in communities which are very much basically Muslim communities. So one of the things that I want to check basically in the social media is where some of the strong anti-Muslim discourse comes, and it comes from the diaspora who is living in London. So from this point of view, you're absolutely right historically, but it appeared that almost 1 million Poles now are exposed in an active encounter with the Muslim populations. And also don't forget, they go to London, and many of them, because they go to the construction industry and so on, these are businesses that are controlled by Pakistanis, others, and so on. So they're ending up not simply having encounter, but working for some of these people. And this kind of there is a hidden racism on this, I agree. Basically, the white people that go there and suddenly, I do believe this plays a very interesting effect if you try to see what are the sources of this anti-Muslim discourse, particularly in Polish debate. I don't believe it's true for the Czech Republic, but for Poland, this
It's
I
probably not, and it may play a role, but I think you would need a much more detailed analysis on that. But what I see is, again, the fear of the unknown rather than fear of what we experience and encounter. And this is a major distinction in psychology between fear, which is an emotion with an object, we know exactly what we fear, and anxiety. And anxiety, which we sometimes describe as free-floating anxiety, is fear without an object. And it's an almost intolerable emotion, and sometimes, no, many times, the only way the person experiencing it can slightly at least cope with the problem is to find an object for the emotion without an object. And it doesn't matter if it's Muslims or if it's man from the moon or from the Mars, or it's, you know, it's something now, we have something to fear, and we can be happy about it. You know, you can't not notice that, you know, a big majority of the people who are screaming about Christian values and our sacrosanct traditions have never been into a church and would not know how to pray if you try to force them. So, so for me, maybe the more important question is, where does the anxiety come from? And again, in psychology, it's usually an existential anxiety, something stemming from uncertainty about the future, and we know that's a big part of it, about the change, and again, we know that's a part of it, and about uncertainty of who we are, about identity. And I think these three things together make for a very combustive mixture that pops up here and there in almost every European country these days. Now, for the fragmentation, I take a slightly different tack based on my limited experience in politics. I mean, it's true that we now hear that it will not be the parliament but the council that wants to choose the new president of the commission, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, the parliament will still have to approve it by a vote. And as has been said, it's like asking the carp to vote for Christmas, to ask a parliament to give up a privilege of days. So I think they will have a big say in the matter. And I think one of the most likeliest way to resolve, to overcome the fact that there is not anymore a majority of the two leading parties is to, the leading groups, is to change the duopoly into triopoly, and to bring in the liberals. And that gives a that gives the Liberals a fair chance at getting the President of the Commission. And in fact, there is a precedent for it. It has happened once before when the EPP and the Socialists could not agree on a candidate, and the winner was Pat Cox, who was an Irish Liberal, and he was the only one that could obtain a majority. And as I know Guy Verhofstadt, I would be very mistaken if he did not push his case very strongly. But we will see. Anyway, I think either way it goes, the triopoly principle is almost a no-brainer for me.
Look, here we can make money. I don't believe that our Belgian colleague is going to become the president of the Commission.
I didn't say that.
Yeah, no, I'm joking. But you're right that you can be.
Yeah.
But here is on fear. I want to give you two data, funny data, but it's very telling. Do you know in the last 30 years, the answer of which question best predicts who is going to be elected president of the United States? This is the answer of the question, who of the candidates believe is going best to protect America from the invasion of aliens? And on the answer of this question, always basically the candidate that gets the answer was the one that won the elections. And secondly, on fears, this is part of the entertainment. At the end of the Cold War, there was a major study of the fears that have been done, what different nations fear. And if it turned out that Americans fear communism, Soviet Union turned to fear Cold War, and the Yugoslavs turned to fear snakes. But you know, basically, so you don't know which of the fears is more dangerous, knowing what happened to all these countries. So this was okay.
Okay, well, let's now open the conversation. Please.
Thank you so much. It was insightful. My name is Olivia Carville, Institute of International Studies here. I would probably start with a comment on Islamophobia in Poland, because I believe that there is one important place when Polish people met Muslims, and that was in the 1990s with refugees from Chechnya. But then they were welcomed because it was some kind of solidarity against Russia. I think it's a very good example that it's not about Muslims themselves, but how it's presented and interpreted in the media. And that leads me to my questions. So when you are asking people in your survey, this is how you are pushing them to think about something. But I wonder what was circulating in media around these elections. What topics were the best instrumentalized? What was discussed around that? And it, like, from my perspective, there are some questions which I'm particularly interested in. The first one is these non-systemic parties, right? So this anti-establishment movement, it brought not only populist right-wing parties, but something like pirates in Czech Republic or Screen Grosna in Poland. How much does it change the disposal? What kind of a social request is different? That's kind of the first question. And the second one, since it's like a personal one, because I come from Ukraine, the whole Russian-Ukrainian issue, or even the EU-Russia relations discussions, was it present at all in these discussions? Because from my perspective, not so much. Thank you.
I'll go listen. One of the interesting stories, people now are studying much more this than before because social media is not so difficult to monitor and to study. And you're going to see that a lot of people are doing research based on the keywords and others because the public space has very much fragmented itself. People are staying basically quite often in the echo chambers of people who basically share their opinions, and from this point of view, it's not going to come to news for you that the most active on the social media this kind of populist parties, and one of the reasons is that they were basically out of some of the mainstream media, so their disadvantage turned to their advantage. But what is much more interesting about this type of a framing is that, and this was, the problem with any opinion poll starts from the fact that we assume, nevertheless we know that it's not true, but somewhere in the back of our mind, we believe that people have a non-contradictory views. That if you basically go with certain positions, your next position should be related to this position. If you basically don't like this and that, it means that you're going to do this and that. But people are very contradictory. All of us are very contradictory. One of the things that we did very much in the survey is not just trying to see what people think, but how they feel about certain things. And here's an interesting story for you. As you know, a series of surveys, where our survey is just one of many, the confidence towards the EU has increased in the last 3 or 4 years, so it's higher than in any time in the last 25 years. Part of it, by the way, is the result of the populist parties entering the debate, because some people that have been very critical to the way the EU functions said, now it's better because my view is represented. But it is at the same time a question being asked, do you believe that the European Union is going to be around in 20 years? And majorities in every country, with the exception of Spain, said, we cannot be sure. So this is much more Euro-pessimism than Euroscepticism. People don't know, this is uncertainty, how we should know. European Union on one level is taken for granted, but on the other side is very much finds challenge, and here comes also the Ukraine-Russia story. First of all, we have a Ukrainian elections that took place also, take place very close to the European elections. In a strange way, the Ukrainian elections were not very different than the European elections. People wanted change, and they can find change anywhere they want. But what was interesting is that the major Ukrainian narrative about what is happening was an epic war between the Ukrainian society and Russia. And these elections does not make this narrative stand. Because in the moment of war, you can vote for a crazy general, but you're not voting for a comedian. In a moment of war, you're not electing a comedian as the commander-in-chief. And as a result of it, this created a situation in Europe to say, do we understand what is happening in Ukraine? Russia's situation is even more difficult, particularly for the far right, because Russia is one of the issues that makes it difficult for Mr. Salvini to create a big group. And here the problem is Mr. Kaczynski in Poland. Basically, Kaczynski said, I'm never going to be part of a group of which Marine Le Pen is a member because she's paid by the Russians. My, to be honest, personal, slightly cynical interpretation was that he's attacking Le Pen in order to close his eyes to what Orban and Salvini are doing with respect to Russia, because honestly speaking, out of the three, Orban is delivered to the Russians much more than Le Pen or Salvini. But of course you're right, that not simply because of the change of composition in the parliament, but because of the change of the composition of the council, keeping sanctions on Russia is going to be more and more difficult. The only thing that probably is going to help for this to go once more for 6 months is the Strache scandal in Austria, which make the Russia again very much a big issue for the far right. Nevertheless, at this time Russians were not involved. This time it was not that Russians were giving money to somebody, but it was the far right waiting for some Russians to give them money. And particularly if it's a blunt lady, they cannot resist not taking them. But from this point of view, this is an issue, but there are going to be major issues on foreign policy in general with the rise of the far right. There's going to be a policy when it comes to trade policies. Don't forget that 1/3 of the members of the European Parliament can veto and block any type of a trade agreement that the European Commission has signed. And most of the trade agreements are quite contradictory. Remember what was TPP and so on and so on. And here you can have also a very easy coalition between far right and far left when it comes on trade issue. The United States is also an interesting issue because, and this is my last point on this, there is something very interesting. If you see President Trump made a very strong move saying, I like this new populist right coming. He met Mr. Orban in the White House 2 weeks before the elections, which is a very high level of endorsement. So for such a strong political message coming from the White House. And of course, he was very positive of Mr. Salvini and others. At the same time, none of these political leaders of governments are particularly supportive to the 3 issues for which America at the moment declares that it cares most. On China, Italian government is the only G7 government that signed with the Chinese on One Belt, One Road. On Venezuela, neither Hungary, no Italy, no any of these countries were major allies of the United States. And on Russia, which at least, particularly if not for Trump personally, but at least for his administration, because of the sanctions is a major issue, all these three countries are basically not natural allies. So there is this interesting divorce between ideological friends of the American president and the allies of his own administration when it comes to concrete policies. And I'm interested to see how this is going to be reflected, but there is an ambassador sitting next to me, so he probably should answer.
Easy questions, right? Now, first on the non-systemic parties. On the face of it, and I was trying to illustrate it on the figures, not much has changed. I mean, the four parties of the establishment, if you count the Greens as a party of the establishment, which is debatable, but they've been there for so long now that I think there is an argument for that. They lost 6 seats, which means that the anti-systemic parties, which are fragmented between the reformists, the anti-Europeans, the far left, and others will find it very, very difficult to find a common position, a common stance. But in other respects, and here I follow on what Ivan said, yes, people are contradictory, but they find it difficult to live with contradictions. And so there is this well-researched principle of cognitive dissonance that makes people try to bridge the incompatibles and look for some kind of a compromise in their positions. And this is, I think, one of the most important outcomes of the elections, because almost no party now, except the Brexit party and a few others, now speak of exiting the European Union. And almost no party now claims that the status quo is sustainable. Reform is the keyword of the moment. You know, parties on the right and left and center, they all speak about the need for the reform of the European Union. And I think this is a good thing. This is a debate that has long been necessary, and maybe it will start now. For the Ukrainian election, I regret to say that I haven't detected any influence of the presidential elections in Ukraine and of the situation in general on the Czech public debate and the outcome of the elections. I think the most effect it could have was in the country closest to Ukraine, and that's Slovakia. Slovakia is one of the surprises of this election, with a new kid on the block that did not exist 6 months ago, and has suddenly beaten the government party and is pro-European, anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, etc., and is now a breath of fresh air in the region. Which brings me to my last point, and that's Central Europe. I think many people have expected that there might be a signal coming out of this election that the situation is changing in the Central Europe, that the perceived danger of illiberal democracies, Sensu, Orban and Kaczynski will recede. And obviously this has not happened, and especially for some of our Polish friends, this is a heavy setback. And in this country, in the Czech Republic, it's more or less business as usual. with the exception of the grand collapse of the Social Democratic Party, the oldest party in this country. Although it's not a party I vote for, I very much regret that this is happening, because most of us agree that if we didn't have a Social Democratic Party, we would have to invent it, and it's going in the opposite direction. So there will be a phenomenon or a problem or an issue of Central Europe in the new EU, in the new Parliament, in the new Commission, etc., and I think we should all start thinking about how to mitigate the problem, because it could work against us all.
Just
Just on this, because I find Polish elections also very important. As we talk, Poland is a very polarized place. It was a very high turnout, and also Mr. Kaczynski got more votes than ever before. As I told you, this is a very polarized space. It was also additionally polarized because of certain things happening just on the eve of the elections, important documentary film about pedophilia in the church and so on, which basically mobilized both sides. But I'm saying this because this was not an anti-migration mobilization when it comes to Poland, because migration was very low, and Kaczynski, being a good politician, he got it very early. Also keep in mind that Poland is the EU member states which in the last 3 or 4 years has received most foreign labor than any other country. These are Ukrainians basically who are working now in Poland. It was much more about sexual minorities. It was an anti-rainbow campaign. And this is interesting because I can see this type of a divide coming, and then the environmental divide also being very much played. And I'm saying this because these cultural issues are quite interesting. I don't understand anything in Czech politics, totally nothing. Never made a statement, never made a mistake as a result of it. We have an old friend who is Mr. Žantovský, who was elected on the list of one of the Conservative Party with huge preferences. And I was asking somebody Sasha Vondra, how he was elected. And I got a very interesting answer that I want to share with you, because I found the answer very interesting. This person told me, Sasha smoked his way to the European Parliament, which means that he was going in front of these pubs and so on. He was not active on social media, so it's not this type of story. But the very fact that smoking culturally kind of rejecting certain type of a political correctness is an everyday life of smoking, he managed to create this kind of an image, not of a conservative as a traditionalist, but as a cultural rebel. And this is an interesting story because I found, I don't know is it true or not, I haven't talked to Sasha himself, but I found this a quite important story when we talk about this type of new conservatism. And I'm saying this because Mr. Strache in Austria has 2 policies which were the closest to his heart. They were so important that he allowed Mr. Kurz to change the taxes, not very much in favor of his constituencies, if Kurz is going to allow him first to reintroduce smoking in the restaurants, and secondly, high speed on the highways. And people are saying how stupid he is. He's not stupid at all. Because for his type of constituency, this is a culturally significant things which are not excluding their way of life. Freedom Party is a blue-collar workers' party. This is the new workers' party of Austria. More than 70% of the blue-collar workers are voting for the Freedom Party. So as a result of it, making normal certain habits that have been disappeared from the middle classes, particularly urban middle classes, but are still very much there with the working class, and secondly, high speed in which you can show up and so on, and particularly for the younger people from this social milieu, this is very important. I'm saying this because it's interesting. For the first time, you see political parties which are delivering to the working classes not money, but strange type of a cultural recognition based on a kind of a certain policies, and this is why I'm interested on your comment on Sasha smoking his way.
No, you're absolutely right. It was a part of the image he's been building for a couple of years, but it's not the whole picture. The whole picture is pro-smoking, anti-multicultural, anti-political correctness, and anti-Me Too, and this kind of cultural rebellion pointing towards life normality as we used to know it. And yeah, and it works. Actually, it worked very well. I think he got the second highest number of preferences in the polls, and I think he will build up on that in his 5 years, knowing him in his 5 years in the European Parliament, and you know, to succeed, he also changed his physical appearance, and he now looks, you know, with the beard and big body, etc., like kind of a wild man. And some voters, many voters, find it liberating. And I think liberating is the word I was looking for, because many voters are rebelling against what they perceive as hypocrisy, as some kind of a new doctrine that is not really internalized and observed even by the people who preach it. And it's, you know, there's a very interesting experiment I recommend to everyone. Try to drive on one of the LA highways at 7 or 8 in the morning as people drive to work, and look into the cars, and you will see every second driver will smoke. You know, people who would not be seen with a cigarette near a university or a public place, etc., are getting their fix before they go to work. And it gives you a thought.
I think, but in a way, it plays on a different kind of xenophobia, maybe, because I think, and to me, you know, he exemplifies it, even with his wild man appearance, as you said. He tries to kind of fight for a certain vision of natural life bygone, and in this discourse, you know, it's the European Union which comes with all this regulation, imposing political correctness, and, you know, making this old way of life, natural life, disappear. But I had one question in mind. Both of you pointed out in one way or another that now pretty much everyone in the European political landscape wants to reform the EU rather than to get out. And in your view, how credible are these kind of political visions or utopias of those who are saying that? And the corollary question to that is, when this is being said from the mainstream, from the mainstream political forces, isn't there a risk? And now, I mean, this is Patočka debate, but I will only invoke reference Patočka very ironically. But isn't there some sort of solidarity of the shaken suffered by the elite? But after, you know, they've lived through that, now they can take the respite because it hasn't gone as bad as some had feared, but they will carry on and, you know, really change nothing.
Listen, you talk about utopias, but I don't see much more utopian thinking. You have what kind of change you see? First of all, one of the changes is the European Union at its present form, the European Union that should be. And then you can start talk about a much more closer cooperation between countries. They could be Schengen within Schengen and so on. Particularly from the French side, the idea was enlargement was too early, it was too destructive, and from this point of view, European Union first should try to consolidate the core, so you're going to have a federalist version, but not federalist version on the territory of the European Union as a whole, but the kind of the idea of the optimal union, much more around Eurozone and so on. On the other side, you have basically the Orban-Kaczynski vision, who said, common market is fine. We understand that we are nationalists, but we don't have a national economies anymore. 30% of the industrial production of Hungary comes from 4 German companies. So this is not the nationalism of the 19th century. So from this point of view, the idea of the sovereignty is we are ready to share a market, but we are not going to allow anybody to interfere in our domestic politics. How we are solving the problem of our media, of our universities, and so on, this should not be the problem of the European Union. So this is not a classical sovereignism against the EU, but just leave me there. And if you want, we're going to have, so in a certain way, you're going to have a property rights being equally defended over the European space, but when it comes to political rights, it's going to be basically decided on the national base. And of course, you have the Greens. And the interesting story about the Greens, it's very much generational. From this point of view, they're different Greens than the Green Party that came after 1968. And the problem of the Greens, is the way I see them, is the following. The younger generation in Europe today is a small cohort. There are not many of you. If you compare with 1968, what kind of percent the young people were, it's much smaller percent. As a result of it, the voting power of the younger generation is smaller. And also many of the younger people do not vote much. So you're going to see this type of a younger generation much more on the streets than in front of the ballot box, because you believe that you can much more influence the political debate by being seen, by protesting, by being active, than simply by voting. And also this generation has a very strong anti-institutional kind of an ethos, so for them being part of the political parties, even NGOs and so on, is not as popular as in the previous generation. There was a major study that the RAND Corporation did on the millennials. And one of the most interesting findings was the following. It was this was basically commissioned by the Pentagon, because Pentagon were very much struck by the fact, are these people interested to serve in the army? How easy is going to be basically to recruit soldiers from this generation? And they found that for the millennials, the idea of the career is not as important as in the previous generation. So for example, you have a young person who wants to go and for 10 years to serve in the special forces, but after 10 years, he's going to say, this was a great experience, and now I want a different experience. I want to go as a cook to work somewhere in Thailand. By the way, for the military, this is the end of the world. The lieutenant that does not want to become a captain, and the captain who does not want to become a colonel, this is the end of the army. So from this point of view, you have a people who are much more valuing having diverse experiences than having a normal career. Basically, the idea of the vertical is really very much replaced by I want to do different things, I want to change jobs, I want to be different, and so on and so on. So for these people, and this is the problem with the Greens, suddenly they discover that their vote makes sense not so much on what you're going to do about this and that, but you change the perspective of society. They want societies to get out of the dominance of the older generations, which have a time horizon very different than theirs. And here comes your question on the reform. German society is aging society, very rich society, very well functioning. So they see Europe in the way the pension funds see it. It's a very risk averse. When you're asking the Germans why you don't pay your surplus, you have incredible surplus, spend it. They said, we're aging society, we should keep this money because we should pay pensions with them at some point. It's a very low risk policy. On the other side, you have France, which basically is having a much bigger problem, and they said, from this point of view, to get the legitimacy, we should do something radical. Even if it's going to be wrong, this should be much more radical. If we're not going to change anything, and after seeing the data of this survey, I understand why Macron believes it, we're going to lose total support. Public is very much totally disappointed with everything. They don't trust anybody, they don't trust anything. And if you see closer to the yellow jacket phenomena, this is a very interesting story. This is not the poorest part of the population. Most of these people work, and most of these people have small businesses of their own. This is why they're protesting on the weekends.
And they drive cars. Yeah.
And it's interesting about driving cars. They're not simply driving cars, and they're going to pay 1,000 more as a result of his policies. And they're right to say why he's not taxing planes and he's taxing cars. But imagine many of these people are spending 3 hours per day driving to work, coming back from the work. This is awful, because the idea that you're wasting your time is much more, if in 60s, driving a car in the United States was a liberating experience. And you're going to see a lot of also literature, poems, Kerouac is like this. You're on the road, you're in your car, and in a certain way, basically you achieved freedom. After Nirvana, this was the second best that can happen to you, to drive a car. Now people had the feeling that they cannot get out of their cars. I was always giving this example that struck me. I was in Russia some years ago, and this was a major traffic jam. And for the first time, I understood what is for me the difference between Soviet Union and Russia. Soviet Union was the queue. You're queuing in front of a shop. You want to buy something, because in Russia, like, you know, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria was different, but there was a major deficit of goods. So people are staying for hours in front of a shop, and they're queuing, and even they don't know what they're queuing. But if they're going to be very unhappy, they can go home. They're not going to buy anything, but they can leave. In this traffic jam, you're in a car. It's not cold. You can even listen to the music. On the phone, you can talk to your boyfriend, but you cannot move. There is nowhere to go. If you're really pissed off, if you go crazy, you can go nowhere with your car. And this idea of being stuck is very strong. I was always planning the following political science research. If somebody of you is interested to do it, this is my gift. Try to get how much time a different person spends being stuck in a traffic jam, and try to compare with the relations to political system, political institution, satisfaction of life, comparing with the same person, with the same profiles, socioeconomic educations and others who does not have this experience. Because in my view, the time that you're spending basically stuck in a traffic is your most strong sensation that you're wasting your time, that you're basically kind of robbed.
All right. No, this is a beautiful metaphor because I think that what's behind the anger and the frustration of many of the voters voting for the anti-systemic protest parties, etc., is the feeling of being stuck. You know, we are talking here about the millennials and the new ways of life they are experimenting with and going globally around the world, etc., etc. And because we usually discussing this with people of that kind, we sometimes forget that, at least in our countries, most people are not like that. You know, they still in spending a large part of their lives in one town, in one job, in one flat, etc., etc. And many of them feel that, you know, there are these globalizers and they have breakfast in Hong Kong and on sushi, and then they go for fish and chips in London, and then they go for a steak for dinner in New York in the evening. And
But they got their beer at the end of the night in Prague.
yeah, and you know, what do we have? You know, we in one place, we in one social situation, and we stuck, and we don't like it. And that's the difference between freedom and being stuck. That your experience from driving a car is similar to. As for the millennials, I think it's for them obviously to you know, choose their own lifestyle and their way, and we are trying to be in touch, be old weasers, and discuss things with them, but in the end they will make the decisions, etc., etc. I'm only not sure whether, you know, thinking that the younger you are, the better decisions you make is self-evident. And, you know, we've already had proposals about going down for the age of voting to 16 years, and etc., and even lower. You know, I sometimes think that, you know, if you're a 3-year-old, you know, the most difficult problem in the world is the shortage of sand, you know, and because you need a sandbox. But I'm not quite sure whether this is the best way to direct the world around. So I had another important thing to say regarding the beginning of your latest intervention, and I forgot what it was. Remind me. Oh, okay.
I will come back. But may I ask if there is a question or comment or has been said from the audience?
And better comment than a question.
Either will do. Ludwig.
Well, I have another question on one of your metaphors, Mr. Žantovský, because now you refer to Ivan's metaphor, but you brought up the metaphor of the divorce. There was an astonishing absence of Brexit in the debate, because it was very, very weak. First question, what do you think, to what extent did Brexit influence the elections on Sunday, or the days before? And secondly, and this is, the metaphor with the divorce is even better, because the funny thing about divorce is that once you have split up, it's not over, right? I mean, it depends on how bad the divorce was. If it was quite bad, you wish the other one to be unhappy, and you follow the other one, and you want him or her to be unhappy, and it was very bad, you want them to be miserable, right? So that brings me to the question, to what extent will Brexit, and I think Ivan takes it as a ground factor, that Brexit will happen, that it is over, and in that sense we don't have to discuss British policy anymore very much, but nevertheless Britain will still have an influence. How do you see this?
Well, we tend to agree with Ivan on the likelihood of Brexit happening. It has already influenced the election in influencing the balance. Of course, the number of seats for the Brexit party is very high, and it will weigh on the anti-systemic side of the equation. But you know, for me, the recurring question is, how did we get here? And a good divorce is an art. And in this particular instance, I think the old rule came back to me that, you know, for every bad divorce, you need 2 parties. And in this case, unfortunately, we had 2 parties. I believe that the British government mishandled both the negotiations and the parliamentary procedure in getting the Brexit or the deal approved. And I think the European Union or Barnier or whoever it was were absolutely wrong in insisting on this kind of a deal that, in my mind, never had a chance of passing the British Parliament. And so the mystery to me is, how could Prime Minister May sign that deal if she, you know, had to know or at least suspect that it wouldn't come through. And at the same time, I believe that without the Irish backstop, the deal had a good chance of making it through the Parliament, and we wouldn't be where we are today. But this is water past the bridge. But I remembered now what I wanted to say before, and that's the reform issue. I mean, there's this saying, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And half of the people in the European Parliament and in the European institutions, after they somehow managed to set up a commission and the president of the commission will probably or will run the risk of believing that we can go on with business as usual. But I disagree. I believe that the system is broke and needs fixing, and I could now speak for a long time, but in a nutshell, I don't think there is any reform without reopening the treaty. And this is something that's been with us for the last 7 or 8 years, 8 years actually, the absolute panic and fear of what would happen if we reopened the treaty, you know, the abyss would open up and the flames would come out and we would all be dead or something. It's not like that in the life of societies and institutions, and the European Union is the best proof of that. For 40 years, it muddled through various crises and bumps in the road, etc. Always, you know, overcome the issues. Always came out stronger than before, and if it wants to remain a vital and energetic institution, it must reform. Otherwise, I'm afraid the fearmongers are right.